Republican Senator Mike Lee, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, says it would be a mistake for Democrats to impeach President Trump. He's got a new book out. It is titled Our Lost Declaration, America's Fight Against Tyranny, From King George to the Deep State. Senator Lee, good morning. Good to have you here.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Want to get to your book in just a minute, but I want to talk to you about something I think that's extremely important. You are a former lawyer. The Supreme Court has just announced that it will take on and decide if the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guarantees protections from workplace discrimination to gay and transgender people. This is going to be a big deal. So should it be legal to fire someone if they are gay or transgender?
The question before the court is one of statutory construction, or rather than constitutional interpretation. There are some federal courts of appeals that have held that the term sex in that context includes sexual orientation and gender identity, other courts that haven't. It's why we have a Supreme Court, and this is one of the things that routinely triggers the Supreme Court to grant review. It reviews a very small segment of all the cases that come before it, concluded that this one needed review because lower courts have decided it differently.
Got it. But the question that I asked you, right, it's made its way through court. Should it be legal to fire someone who is gay or transgender?
I think most Americans would have a hard time with an employer deciding to fire someone simply on the basis of their sexual orientation. For that reason, most states, nearly every state, has some type of prohibition against that.
So you think the Supreme Court may actually, because the Trump administration is saying essentially yes, legally, that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act should not include protections for gay or transgender people.
Right. The argument that they're making is that the language in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 doesn't extend that long. Now, that far. At the time, they didn't have this in mind, but the fact that they didn't have it in mind doesn't close the question as to whether the language they actually used is sufficiently broad to cover this.
Okay, final last question. Yeah.
Should Congress tighten that up?
I suspect that Congress will be called upon to tighten up the language.
And you would support
perhaps
that?
Perhaps depending on how the Supreme Court decides this case. One can imagine a number of different versions of that legislation, some of which could garner support, others wouldn't.
There are intense discussions right now within the Democratic Party to impeach or not to impeach. Your own record is saying, no, we should not impeach because, other than the fact that you're a Republican, why do you say no to impeachment?
Well, first and foremost, the impeachment power is one that very often instinctively feels to the impeaching party like the impeaching party is gaining something from it. It is gaining something at the expense of the executive branch. In some ways, history has taught us that the opposite can be true. In the absence of something that is truly unacceptable and where you really have to get rid of somebody and do it quickly, when you impeach, you often end up unwittingly strengthening the executive branch and strengthening the executive in office at the time. Some of that occurred with President Clinton about 2 decades ago, and I believe some of that would be true this time around if the Democrats made the unfortunate choice to initiate impeachment proceedings here.
Do you think the Mueller report will hurt the Republicans in 2020?
I don't believe so. A recent poll that I became aware of yesterday, I think it was done by Rasmussen, suggested that most Americans' opinion of the president, of this presidency, of the Trump administration, has not changed and is unlikely to change as a result of the
We
Mueller
don't generally use Rasmussen in our polling, but there is actually a new poll out from Politico actually this morning that shows that after the Mueller report that President Trump's approval rating is now as low as it was following the violence in Charlottesville. So it has hurt his approval ratings.
Some of the reports that have surrounded it, I think, might end up having a short-term impact on how they feel about him. But they're not expected to change how they view him in the big picture.
It didn't alarm you at all by reading the Mueller report? I mean, there was a key finding, there were so many, but let's just take one, for example, that the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful. That is largely because the persons surrounding the president decided not to carry out the orders or accede his request. I mean, particularly the White House counsel, Don McGahn.
Sure. Anytime you've got a president, that president's going to be surrounded by staff. In this case, he was surrounded by some very good staff. From time to time, a public official, president of the United States or otherwise, will have some ideas that, on further reflection, were not good ideas. These ideas were not good ideas, and the staff acted appropriately here in order to walk him off the ledge. So, at most, we're dealing with inchoate actions, inchoate thoughts, things that never fully culminated to doing the sorts of things that could have been more troubling.
Let me ask you about your book, Our Lost Declaration. You've worked really hard to try to keep the founders in the conversation. Their standard that they created, here with respect to the Declaration, the summer of 1787. When you think about the Mueller report and the 55 men who met that summer in Philadelphia, does the behavior of the president in the Mueller report meet the standard those men hoped for in the presidency of the United States?
I'll tell you what I think doesn't meet the standard of what the founders had in mind when they set up our system of government. It doesn't meet the standard of keeping power sufficiently divided and accountable to the people. And that's why I wrote this book. I point out that things like the Boston Tea Party occurred as a result of a large, distant, heavily bureaucratic government making decisions for people that ended up harming poor and middle-class people. Citizens ended up taking matters into their own hands because their government had become oppressive. So I think what would be most stunning to the founders is that if they looked at our system of government today, they would see this creeping administrative state, or deep state as some have called it, that deep state is not accountable to the people who vote presidents into office.
I understand, but they also
that's a problem.
They thought a lot about the president. That's why they made General Washington the president of the convention. Patrick Henry didn't even go because he was so worried about the presidency. So back to the question. Do you think the current president meets the standard for the office that they created in that summer? They created this new thing, this amazing new thing. Does the sitting president meet the standard that they had hoped for in that office?
I think President Trump has done a lot of things to help restore the kind of system of government that was put in place by our founding generation. He has reined in the federal bureaucracy. He's done a lot to make the federal government more responsive to the citizens, to make it more limited so that it doesn't have so much discretion to do bad things. That does not mean that in every instance he's an angel. And in fact, the founding fathers understood that wouldn't be the case, that human beings are not angels. You don't put someone into power to make them a king. That was the very system we had rebelled against when we drafted the Declaration of Independence. And so the fact that there are things in the Mueller report maybe unflattering at times shouldn't surprise us. You can find unflattering things with regard to every president in U.S. history. The reason the Declaration is so important, and the reason I've chosen to write a book about it, is to reveal that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Human nature is still such. You're going to have people who make mistakes in office. If you want to teach your son or your daughter, your grandson, your granddaughter about American history, and let them know more about America's founding and the principles behind the Declaration of Independence, this book would make a great gift for Mother's Day, Father's Day,
or graduation.
National Sofa Care Week.
You said
Graduation also.
Thomas Jefferson worked very hard to get this right. Thank you very much, Senator Mike Lee.